You're 30,000 feet in the air, cruising above the clouds, when suddenly a single moment changes everything. A flight attendant, stressed and overworked, loses her temper. A pregnant woman, just trying to get comfortable on a long flight, becomes the target of that frustration. And then it happens, a slap, a gasp, a stunned silence. But what no one on that plane knows yet is that this isn't just any passenger. This woman's husband holds a secret that will turn this entire situation upside down. By the time the wheels touch the ground, lives will be changed forever, and one person's impulsive decision will have consequences no one could have predicted. Let's rewind a bit. The story begins with a young couple, Marcus and Naomi, boarding a flight headed to New York. Naomi, 7 months pregnant, is exhausted but excited. This trip is a celebration, a baby moon as they call it. Marcus, ever the doting husband, has gone out of his way to make sure Naomi is comfortable. He's even booked them first-class seats, hoping the extra space will make the journey easier for her. But as anyone who's ever flown knows, even the best-laid plans can go awry. The flight is packed, the cabin crew is stretched thin, and tensions are running high. Enter Sarah, the flight attendant. She's been working back-to-back shifts for weeks, and it's starting to show. Her smile is forced, her patience worn thin. When Naomi politely asks for a second pillow, Sarah snaps. It's not just about the pillow. It's the exhaustion, the pressure, the feeling of being invisible. But in that moment, Sarah makes a choice she'll soon regret. She slaps Naomi. The sound echoes through the cabin, and for a moment, time seems to stand still. Passengers freeze. Naomi's hand flies to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. Marcus, sitting just a few feet away, is on his feet in an instant, his face a mask of fury. But here's the twist. Marcus isn't just any angry husband. He's the CEO of the airline. Yes, the airline, the one they're currently flying on. He's kept his identity low-key, preferring to travel incognito to get a real sense of how his company operates. But now, as he stares down the flight attendant, who just assaulted his pregnant wife, the mask is off. The other passengers don't know it yet, but they're about to witness a showdown that will leave everyone questioning what it means to have power, and what happens when it's abused. As Marcus demands to speak to the captain, Sarah's face pales. She doesn't know who he is, but she can sense the authority in his voice. The other flight attendants exchange nervous glances. The captain emerges from the cockpit, and Marcus pulls him aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. Meanwhile, Naomi sits in her seat, still reeling. She's not just hurt, she's worried about her baby, about what this means for their trip, about what Marcus might do next, because she knows her husband. And when Marcus is pushed, he doesn't back down. The plane lands, but the drama is far from over. As the passengers disembark, Marcus stays behind, his eyes locked on Sarah. The captain tries to defuse the situation, but it's clear this isn't going to end quietly. Naomi watches from the gate, her heart pounding. She knows Marcus is about to make a decision that will change everything, for Sarah, for the airline, and for their family. But what will he do? Will he fire Sarah on the spot? Will he take legal action? Or will he surprise everyone, including Naomi, with a choice no one sees coming? And what about Sarah? As she stands there, facing the consequences of her actions, she can't help but wonder, how did it come to this? Was it just a moment of weakness, or is there something deeper at play? As the tension builds, one thing is clear. This story is far from over. The next chapter promises to be even more explosive. So, what happens next? Stay tuned, because when power, pride, and human emotions collide at 30,000 feet, the fallout is never simple. As the last of the passengers filed out of the plane, the cabin felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you like a weight. Marcus stood near the front, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Naomi waited by the gate, her hands resting protectively on her belly. She could see the tension in Marcus's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as he spoke to the captain. She knew that look. It was the same one he'd had years ago, when he'd first taken over the struggling airline and turned it into one of the most successful in the industry. Determined, unyielding. But this time, it was personal. Sarah, the flight attendant, stood a few feet away, her uniform rumpled, her face pale. She kept glancing at Marcus, then at the floor, as if she couldn't quite believe what had happened. Her mind raced. How had she let it get to this point? She'd always prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to handle even the most difficult passengers with a smile. But today, something had snapped. The stress of the job, the long hours, the constant demands, it had all boiled over in one terrible moment. And now she was facing the consequences. The captain, a seasoned pilot named Greg, tried to mediate. "Mr. Carter," he began, using Marcus's last name with a hint of deference, "I understand this is a difficult situation, but perhaps we can resolve it without escalating things further." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His eyes flicked to Naomi, who was still standing by the gate, her face a mix of worry and exhaustion. He knew she wanted this trip to be perfect, a chance to relax before the baby came. But now it had turned into a nightmare. "Captain," Marcus said finally, his voice low but firm, "this isn't just about what happened on this flight. This is about accountability, about ensuring that every passenger on my airline is treated with respect. And right now I'm not seeing that." Sarah flinched at his words, her stomach twisting. She wanted to explain, to apologize, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say to make this right? Meanwhile, Naomi's mind was racing. She knew Marcus well enough to know that he wasn't just angry, he was hurt. Hurt that someone had dared to lay a hand on her. Hurt that his own company had failed to protect her. But she also knew that Marcus had a temper, and when he was pushed too far, he could be ruthless. She didn't want this to turn into a public spectacle, but she also couldn't ignore what had happened, not just for her sake, but for the sake of every passenger who might find themselves in a similar situation. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. The other flight attendants hovered nearby, unsure of what to do. They'd never seen anything like this before. One of them, a young woman named Emily, finally stepped forward. "Mr. Carter," she said hesitantly, "I know this doesn't excuse what happened, but Sarah's been under a lot of pressure lately. We all have. The staffing shortages, the delays. It's been really hard on everyone." Marcus turned to look at her, his expression softening slightly. He knew the challenges his employees faced. He'd been working tirelessly to address them. But the industry was still recovering from the chaos of the past few years. Still, that didn't excuse what had happened. "I appreciate your honesty," Marcus said, his tone measured. "But pressure doesn't justify unprofessional behavior, and it certainly doesn't justify assault." The word hung in the air, heavy and final. Sarah's shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. She wanted to disappear, to rewind the clock and do everything differently. But she couldn't. All she could do was wait and see what happened next. Outside the plane, the airport buzzed with activity. Passengers hurried to their gates, luggage wheels clattering against the floor. But for Naomi, the world felt like it had slowed to a crawl. She watched Marcus through the window, her heart aching for him. She knew how much he cared about his company, about the people who worked for him. This wasn't just about her, it was about his values, his vision for what the airline could be. And now, that vision had been shattered. As she stood there, a thought occurred to her. What if this wasn't just about Sarah? What if it was about something bigger? She remembered the stories Marcus had told her about the challenges he'd faced. When he first took over the airline, the resistance from some of the senior staff, the pushback against his changes. Could this be connected? Or was she reading too much into it? She wasn't sure, but the idea nagged at her, adding another layer of unease to an already tense situation. Back on the plane, Marcus was deep in conversation with the captain. "I want a full report on what happened," he said, "and I want to know what steps are being taken to ensure this doesn't happen again." Greg nodded, his expression serious. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I'll personally oversee the investigation." Marcus glanced at Sarah, who was still standing silently, her eyes downcast. "And her?" he asked. "What's going to happen to her?" Greg hesitated. "That's up to HR, but given the circumstances, I imagine she'll be suspended pending further review." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. He knew this wasn't just about one flight attendant. It was about the culture of the company, about the systems in place, or not in place, to support his employees. He'd always believed that happy employees led to happy customers, but now he was starting to wonder if he'd been blind to the cracks in the foundation. As much as he wanted to protect Naomi, he also knew he had a responsibility to his team, and that meant getting to the bottom of what had really happened. As the conversation wrapped up, Marcus turned to leave. But before he did, he paused and looked at Sarah. "I hope you understand the gravity of what you've done," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't just about my wife. It's about every person who steps onto one of my planes, trusting that they'll be treated with dignity and respect. That trust has been broken, and it's going to take a lot to rebuild it." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to say something, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Marcus walked off the plane, his mind still churning. He needed to talk to Naomi, to make sure she was okay, but he also needed to figure out what to do next. This wasn't just a personal issue. It was a professional one, and as the CEO, he had a responsibility to address it head-on. But how? What was the right move? As he approached Naomi, he could see the worry in her eyes. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know one thing. This isn't over, not by a long shot." And he was right, because as they walked through the airport, heading toward the exit, neither of them noticed the man standing a few feet away, watching them intently. He was dressed in a suit, his face partially hidden by a hat, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He'd been on the plane, sitting a few rows behind Marcus and Naomi, and he'd seen everything. Now, as he watched them leave, he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. "It's done, they took the bait." He hit send, then slipped the phone back into his pocket and disappeared into the crowd. What did it mean? Who was he? And what was his connection to everything that had just happened? The answers were still hidden, buried beneath layers of secrets and lies, but one thing was certain: this story was far from over, and the next chapter was going to be even more explosive. As Marcus and Naomi stepped out of the airport and into the cool evening air, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily between them. Naomi could feel the tension radiating off Marcus, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. She wanted to say something, to comfort him, but she wasn't sure where to start. Instead, she squeezed his hand again, a silent reminder that she was there for him, no matter what. Marcus glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment, before he turned his attention back to the car, waiting for them. The driver, a man named James, who had been with Marcus for years, opened the door for them, his face a mask of professionalism. But even he couldn't hide the flicker of concern in his eyes as he took in Marcus's grim expression. The ride to the hotel was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound filling the space. Naomi leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights blur past. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts about the baby, about Marcus, about the woman who had slapped her. She couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face, the mix of anger and regret in her eyes. It was easy to be furious, to demand justice, but there was a part of Naomi that couldn't help but wonder what had driven Sarah to that moment. What kind of pressure had she been under? What had pushed her over the edge? Naomi didn't have the answers, but the questions lingered, adding a layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Meanwhile, Marcus was lost in his own thoughts. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened and what it meant for the airline. He'd always prided himself on running a tight ship, on creating a company culture that valued both employees and customers. But now, he was forced to confront the possibility that he'd missed something big. He thought about the conversation he'd had with the captain, about the staffing shortages and the delays. He'd known things were tough, but he hadn't realized just how bad it had gotten. And then there was Sarah. He couldn't shake the image of her standing there, trembling, her career hanging by a thread. He didn't want to ruin her life, but he also couldn't ignore what she'd done. It was a dilemma with no easy answers. When they arrived at the hotel, Marcus and Naomi were greeted by the staff with the usual warmth and professionalism. But even here, in the luxurious surroundings, the tension from the flight lingered. As they made their way to their suite, Naomi finally broke the silence. "Marcus," she said softly, "what are you going to do?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that I can't just let this go. It's not just about us. It's about the company, about everyone who works for me. I have to figure out what went wrong and how to fix it." Naomi nodded, understanding. She knew how much the airline meant to him, how much he'd sacrificed to build it into what it was today. But she also knew that this wasn't just a business problem, it was a personal one, and that made it all the more complicated. As they settled into their suite, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he read. The message. It was from his assistant Claire, who had been with him for years. "We need to talk," the message read. "It's urgent." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. Claire wasn't one to overreact, so if she said it was urgent, it was. He excused himself and stepped into the other room to call her. "What's going on?" he asked as soon as she picked up. Claire's voice was tense. "I just got off the phone with HR. They've been getting complaints from flight attendants for months about the workload, the hours, the lack of support. But it seems like none of it made it to your desk." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I'm saying there's a bigger problem here," Claire replied. "And it's not just about one flight attendant losing her temper. It's about the whole system." Marcus hung up the phone, his mind reeling. He'd always trusted his team to handle things, to bring issues to his attention when they needed to be addressed. But now he was starting to wonder if that trust had been misplaced. He thought about the man he'd seen at the airport, the one who had been watching them so intently. At the time, he'd dismissed it as paranoia, but now he wasn't so sure. Could there be more to this than met the eye? Was someone trying to undermine him, to sabotage the airline from within? The thought was unsettling, but he couldn't shake it. Back in the other room, Naomi was sitting on the bed, her hands resting on her belly. She could hear the tension in Marcus's voice as he spoke to Claire, and it only added to her unease. She wanted to help him, to ease the burden he was carrying, but she didn't know how. All she could do was be there for him, to support him as he navigated this storm. But even as she thought that, a part of her couldn't help but worry about what was coming next. Because one thing was clear, this wasn't just about a slap on a plane, this was about something much bigger, much darker, and the storm was only just beginning. As the night wore on, Marcus and Naomi tried to relax, to put the events of the day behind them. But it was no use. The tension was too thick, the questions too pressing. And as they lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, neither of them could shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something much bigger than they could have imagined. The man at the airport, the complaints from the flight attendants, the slap on the plane, it was all connected. But how? And what did it mean for them, for the airline, for their future? The answers were still out of reach, hidden in the shadows. But one thing was certain. The storm was coming. And when it hit, it would change everything.